and ride-sharing debate here in St. Louis has gotten a lot of attention, including today. You heard that the Taxi Cab Commission has now announced that they will not force riders to have a drug test. However, they're still demanding that drivers have a fingerprint test. We can get to some of that. That's the fight between the Taxi Cab Commission and Uber and Lyft and those ride-sharing companies. Well, last week, the conversation took on another story, and that is Edward Domain wrote an open letter, put it out on Facebook and social media, saying that here's my story about my experience with the St. Louis taxi companies, and it was a story which garnered a lot of attention. Edward Domain, you were on the show, and you talked about in your open letter how you were injured in an accident 2 years ago in which you almost died.
Correct.
And in the 2 years, you've had numerous surgeries. You're still not fully healed officially.
Right.
And your article, your letter and your interview here on the show basically said that Harris Cab, which you mentioned, didn't have insurance. You got a settlement from an insurance company, which you feel was inadequate. And you asked the question, why is Harris Cab continued to allow to be on the street, and yet Uber is not allowed?
That's correct.
Is that a fair?
Absolutely.
What happened? Neil Bruntgranger is the Taxi Cab Commission attorney. They were silent for a good week after your letter was out.
Right.
They have since released an open letter to the public. You have read that letter.
I have.
Neil was on the show about an hour ago. You heard that interview.
I did.
Initially, what were your thoughts after reading that letter and hearing him speak today?
Well, I was on another media program last night, and Neil Bruntgranger and I talked beforehand, and I told him that his client was toxic, and he said, "You and I have a different idea of toxicity." And I said, "Well, maybe you apparently you weren't crippled and almost killed by your client." And he said, "Is this going to get personal?" I said, "Not unless you do." But then I heard him drag out my settlement on there, so I'd be happy to address that with you.
Okay, they claim they have tried to reach out to you to get your side of the story.
So, right, I heard him say that why did he wait 2 years to contact us? Well, for 2 years, the first 6 months after the accident, I was in near death and in a wheelchair. I did not have a hip, and I didn't even know an MTC existed. Is it the public's responsibility to look into which regulatory body takes care of this? Once I found out, my attorneys tried to work with the MTC, and they ignored me, and they obfuscated, and they refused to engage on the issue. Now that I've made it extremely public, suddenly they want to engage.
So you're saying, how long after your injury did you start to try and engage with you?
Oh, my
and your
attorney
lawyer?
did immediately.
Immediately.
He's one of the most respected people.
Jerry Schlichter is
That's
your
correct.
attorney.
Yep.
Okay. In this letter, the Taxi Cab Commission is saying they had no idea about your accident, which was a near fatal accident, until recently, like the last few weeks.
It's very interesting that they're so worried about regulating Uber when they can't even regulate their own cabs and are aware of what their cabs are doing.
Okay, so you say that Harris Cab didn't have any insurance. They
Yes.
say Harris Cab had insurance. They had a dispute with their insurer, but that their insurer ultimately honored their policy and gave you in what they think is approximately $200,000, which is the max or the minimum insurance required by a taxi cab company.
So here's what's great about criminal defense attorneys like Neil Bruntgranger. They're very good at blaming the victim. And so, yes, I did get a settlement for $200,000. I didn't think Neil Bruntgranger was going to make it personal, but apparently he did. So what happened was Harris Cab in court, I have the documents that show this, has admitted in their lawsuit against the insurer, the insurance broker, that they did not have insurance on my cab. They also admitted in court, and I don't have the person's name, another victim went through the exact same thing I did and said they did not have insurance. Now, the insurance broker did settle with me because, as my attorney told me, this could drag on for years and I might get a big settlement, I might not. So the insurance broker played the big bully game and said, we'll give you this. If you go away. And I was desperate because I don't have income because my life has been destroyed by the negligence of the MTC.
Right.
And so I took the settlement for $200,000. After my attorney fees and after outstanding medical bills, I'm down to $140,000. And I would ask Mr. Bruntrager and the MTC if they think that's fair. Is that worth 2 years of my life? The fact that my physical health has been ruined and that my career is gone? I don't think so.
They will say, and again, I'm just here to ask questions.
Certainly.
I'm not picking a side, and I'm not speaking for them. But they would say or respond to the fact that the state of Missouri only requires a taxi cab company to carry $50,000 of insurance. The Taxi Cab Commission forces these cab companies to carry $200,000 insurance. We can argue whether or not that's enough.
Sure.
But you got $200,000, whether they were fully insured or had a dispute or so on and so forth. You got Harris Cab, regardless of how terrible they were, you got your money.
Well, hold on. Now, and I'm glad you brought this up because this is where we get into the reform issue. If I was in a horse-drawn carriage, I would have got $1 million.
Now, why is that?
Because they insure horse-drawn carriages for $1 million. The MTC requires them, but for taxi cabs, they don't. And here's why: the commissioners have hired lobbyists in Jefferson City to create the statutes where they only require. They set the rules on how much insurance they have to have. So saying they force them to have $200,000 is because the lobbyists have paid the legislators to let them do what they want.
Hold on a second. They will say the minimum is 50. The Taxi Cab Commission says we require 200. So the Taxi Cab Commission requires more from the taxi cabs than the state requires.
Right. So why do they have horse-drawn carriages have $1 million? I also have it on good authority that the MTC plans to up those limits liability to $400,000. Unacceptable. If a horse-drawn carriage can be insured for $1 million, they are perfectly capable of insuring cabs for the same price. The same thing that Uber does. And when they say Uber doesn't do that, I've seen the policies myself. This is all publicly available. They said we tried to get Mr. Domain's information about his settlement. You can look it up. Anybody in the public can look it up. They knew what it was, but Neil Bruntrager's very good at spinning and saying, we tried to get this information and it wasn't provided. I'm sorry, Neil, I'm not going to do your job. You're going to have to look it up yourself.
The argument here is you're not necessarily you want these ride sharing companies to come to
Absolutely.
St. Louis, but that's not necessarily your beef, if you will.
Reform and ride sharing.
But ride sharing has nothing to do with your story per se.
Correct.
It's just an offshoot. It's
Right.
part of the story.
That's correct.
But you want to be made whole.
Oh, I would love that to happen.
And so the Taxi Cab Commission, and you know, when you're going to be dealing with these injuries for the rest of your life.
Right.
If you were in the same accident with a company that had insurance and they paid out $200,000, we can argue, boy, they need to raise the insurance, and as ugly as it was in terms of they didn't know about it, ultimately you got your money.
Well, yes, but in a normal case where they did have insurance, what happens in these cases, and you can ask Neil about this, he knows it, is that yes, I would have gotten $200,000 in liability, but then the way the law works, I also would have gotten punitive damages on top of that.
Yes.
I'm short about $1.3 million off of what I should have gotten because Harris Cab was insolvent and there was nothing to get, which they have said in court.
Okay, so punitive damages, for those who don't know, there's the pain and suffering, then punitive damages is the next one that comes on. You're saying that there's no way for you to go after Harris Cab for punitive damages.
Because they're insolvent, and I think that is borderline criminal. I mean, when are they going to stop going after me, the person that they hurt, and when is the MTC going to acknowledge that they can't enforce their own cabs?
Harris Cab is still on the road.
Absolutely.
They have to be somewhat solvent. They're still an ongoing entity.
Isn't that interesting? I find that interesting as well.
Yeah. The letter.
Yes.
Were you offended by the letter?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because the only reason they have replied to this letter is because I turned up the heat on them in public. I have issued, Neil Bruntrager talked about sunshine law requests in California and Uber. I have issued sunshine law requests. They are legally required within 72 hours, 3 business days, to acknowledge receipt of my sunshine law request, yet they have not. They're not going to do anything until they are forced. And since we're making it personal, I would ask Neil Bruntrager how he feels about representing the MTC, whose board chairman almost went to jail for $1 million in tax evasion. His tax liability is more than what I got for having my life destroyed. I think this is just, it's almost comical how this is playing out.
Do you think that if you sat down with your attorney and the commission sat down with their attorney, that you couldn't come to some type of sort of resolution going forward? I guess my question is, what do you want going forward?
Sure. So financial ruin aside, I would like to see the public not have to go through what I did. I would like to see our leaders come out and just. I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. Go ahead. Take your time.
It's emotional subject. I would like to see the public safe. I would like to see the rules for horse-drawn carriages be the same as they are for taxis. I would like to see the MTC stop hiding, using a criminal defense attorney to attack me in public, drag my name through the mud as if, well, we think he got $200,000. They know exactly what it is. It's publicly available. Why go after the victim? Why can't you just do what's right? Why?
So you want so let's get some concrete things here.
Yes.
You want the insurance on the cabs to be as much as the horse-drawn carriages.
Exactly. I don't think that's asking too much.
And then what else do you want?
I want reform of the taxi board. The taxi cab owners should have to recuse themselves from being able to vote on the TNCs that affect them financially. That is one of the big problems. I hope.
Because they're regulating their own industry.
Right.
Yes.
I've sat down with Steve Stenger, the county executive. He's showing great leadership on this issue. I know he's looking into the MTC and the actions of not only the board, but Lou Hamilton in general, or specifically. I hope Lou Hamilton will be replaced for his boorish, bullying behavior in public, racist comments, and hiding and forcing people to, like, everything they do is just wrong. Steve Stenger will then appoint there's one vacancy now he can fill. I hope he does. And I hope that he removes Lou Hamilton and puts somebody responsible and mature in his place.
Yeah. The attorney for the taxi cab commission said that if you got into your accident in an Uber ride, there would be no regulation. You wouldn't have any recourse. There's no legislative body to sort of regulate them.
Right.
So you'd be worse off if you were in an Uber car ride as opposed to a St. Louis taxi.
Sure. So, McGraw, I have yet to meet a criminal defense attorney who has a clunker for a client and then turns around in public and says, you know what? My client really is terrible and awful and dangerous to the public. It's his job to be paid to go after me and to try and spin the story. That is untrue. I have seen, he says we can't see an Uber insurance policy. A driver showed one to me. He pulled it up on his phone. There's $1 million in liability coverage there. I don't get what he's saying.
Where does this go from here? Are you trying to talk to them? Because you said they've tried to reach out to you. Are you two going to get together on this so you can have dueling news conferences and dueling radio interviews? We love it because it's controversy. But quite frankly, at some point, the cooler heads prevail, and you sit into a room and you bring your lawyer, they bring their lawyer, and you sort of come out and shake hands.
I'm glad you brought that up. Cooler heads. For 2 years, I had a cooler head. But once I heard Jamie Dolby from Harris Cab on the radio criticizing Uber, criticizing ride sharing, and saying how taxis were safe after what they have done to me, they have almost $500,000 in tax liens and IRS back taxes, judgments against them. It's not right. So how are we going to fix this? Business leaders have and I'm not talking about just these clueless techies. The biggest names in St. Louis are prepared to make a very formal statement that is going to be coming out next week, and it's going to be very embarrassing for the MTC when every major person of importance in St. Louis puts their name to a document that's coming out next week.
Okay, but that's pouring more gasoline on the fire.
I'm sorry, you're right. So July 29th, the MTC has their next board meeting. We will have approximately 200 people showing up, and we are going to issue a formal notice so they know we're coming. And when does this end? When they finally stop making it about me and trying to discredit me, and when they do the right thing. I don't understand why they can't protect the public and do the right thing. Stop spinning, stop trying to save money, do the right thing.
Here's a question for you.
Sure.
Let's take Harris Cab out of it. Let's take another cab company
that
operates here in St. Louis. The technology already exists to, and I believe they're already using it, where there are apps for other cab companies.
Yeah, there sure are.
And so take another cab company, and all of a sudden they deem themselves no longer a cab company. They deem themselves a ride-sharing app.
Sure.
And they just sort of, instead of calling them on the phone, you use your app.
Right.
Well, then they wouldn't be regulated from the Taxi Cab Commission?
Well, this is just silly spin. There goes Neil again. He's very good at his job, and I've used those apps because I moved to St. Louis without a car. I like not owning a car. Now I bought one. The apps are they're terrible. I've been left waiting. I've put in a request on the app and nobody ever showed up. And I know there's a lot of people out there that say the same thing. To say that taxis are the same as innovative ride-sharing companies is like saying a horse-drawn carriage is the same as a car, and we know that's not the case because the MTC regulates them differently.
Right. Would you like to see taxi cabs and Uber regulated the same?
Absolutely. I don't think anybody deserves special treatment. Neil Bruntrager keeps talking about the safety checks. Chief Dotson has already said he's okay with what Uber has, and then of course Neil Bruntrager will say that's not true. I say let's ask Chief Dotson what he thinks.
Right. One last question for you, Edward Domain, and this isn't necessarily pertains to your story because it's three separate stories.
Absolutely.
Or a couple of different stories. But since you're a lobbyist or lobbying for ride sharing here in town,
yeah, if I was a lobbyist, I'd be getting paid.
Right. They say that they now came out saying that they're no longer going to require drug tests for drivers, but they are going to enforce the fingerprints for drivers. They say they have no choice because it's a state statute that is required by the St. Louis Taxi Cab Commission.
Right.
They say their hands are tied. What do you say?
I know it's so tragic the way their hands are tied, the way our government works. So the Missouri legislator in Jefferson City is going to take away the right of the MTC to regulate. I know this because legislators have reached out to me and let me know this is going to happen. So I don't think we need to worry about the MTC making up their own rules for much longer. But beside that, I'm sorry, I got a little lost. I'm getting emotional.
No, that's all right. The fingerprints.
The fingerprints. So
Yes.
they're willing to waive that temporarily. If they're willing to waive it temporarily, why are they suddenly going to require it later? Because it's a state statute that a lobbyist paid them to do. But then the drug testing thing is silly as well. Drug testing is something that was created by lobbying groups to force employers to spend money on drug testing. If you and I get you want to be safe in a cab. If you drug test a cab driver, you might find out he smoked a joint 3 weeks ago, but you have no idea if he drank a fifth of vodka before he headed into work in the morning.
Right.
It's a red herring. It's silly.
Edward Domain, you're still going to stay in St. Louis?
I love St. Louis. I love this city.
You're a transplanter. How long you been here?
3 years. Well, I say 3 years, but if you take out my time in the hospital, maybe it's a little less, but 3 years.
Where were you born and raised?
Chicago. I'm sorry, the suburbs of Chicago. My family hails from the north side.
Edward Domain, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
You got it. It's 9:27 here, Big 550 KTRS.
This is McGraw Live on KPL.